It is now common on the broad left to refer to the second Trump administration as fascist.
Mm.
Um, I would go as far as to say that this view is now standard, as I think we can all see from protest signs and memes and the discourse. Many liberals and most radicals agree on this point, and I think that's why Anderson reached out so we could have a meeting and talk about this. There are understandable reasons for all this. We've got Elon Musk's Nazi salute on Inauguration Day. We've got the extra
Mm.
legal ICE raids and Trump's ramped up war on the oppressed, on democratic rights, and on seemingly anything good in society. These are all certainly terrifying developments. Certainly, these events share some characteristics in common with fascism. Certainly, Trump has fascists among his base of support and even a few in his White House. Certainly, the US is in a profound crisis, but we reject the idea that all this amounts to fascism specifically. I'm going to argue Trump doesn't have the support he would need to become a fascist dictator, either from the ruling class or from the masses. And I'm also going to argue that that's not his goal. Um, so here's the money quote from Trotsky and the best top-line summary of our argument. Fascism is not merely a system of reprisals, of brutal force, and of police terror. Fascism is a particular governmental system based on the uprooting of all elements of proletarian democracy within bourgeois society. Now, I'm also going to argue against the different yet parallel view that everything is fascism, which I would describe as ultra-left. You can see this tweet from before the election last year that describes Kamala Harris and Tim Walz as fascists, in particular for their roles in overseeing the police and in police repression of protest. You see a lot of this type of thing on the left. Depending on who you ask, the US is a fascist state. The US has always been a fascist state. Israel is fascist. The police are fascists. Um, we can all agree that both major parties have moved steadily rightward over the decades and have made state violence and repression, militarized border security, and imperialist war more and more acceptable in the mainstream. But I think if we describe a Democrat like Harris as fascist, then the word has ceased to have any meaning at all. Um, okay. Um, okay, so when we say that what's going on now isn't fascism, it really pisses some people off. The argument is that we're pedantic with definitions, that we're more interested in gatekeeping the term than we are in doing something about it. Our critics believe we aren't taking the threat seriously enough. We're just sitting back and yapping instead of taking action. Sometimes identity politics are brought in, like we're privileged to be debating fascism while immigrants are rounded up. Um, Not to be defensive, but this does actually relate to the politics of the discussion. We think these arguments are in bad faith. Firebrand comrades have been in the streets every week since January, and I imagine that's true of y'all and GRS too. And we've been organizing against the police, ICE, and real fascists for years, and some of us for decades. There's another line of argument. People say, what does it matter what we call it? If the word fascism inspires people to get out in the streets, it's a good thing, right? According to this view, using the strongest language to describe Trump is the best way to raise mass awareness of the real danger. But we don't think this is a reason to be imprecise or unclear with our vocabulary. That's a bad habit, and it doesn't make for good politics in the long run. Um, Now, of course, we recognize that what's happening now is terrifying and awful, and that people are afraid for a reason. Trump is horrible. There's no question there. There's so many bad things happening all at once, and it's just overwhelming if you have any conscience or human empathy at all. Some of our smarter critics will remind us that fascism arises at times when capitalism is in crisis. And everyone can recognize that we've been in crisis, certainly since the start of the pandemic, but really as far back as the global financial crisis of 2008. We can all see things deteriorating around us. And we also recognize that the fascist movement is indeed growing here in the US and around the world. There are definitely some fascist characteristics of the MAGA movement. There are definitely fascists associated with Trump, and we take Musk's salute very seriously. We believe people when they tell us who they are. All these are valid reasons why the word fascism is on people's lips right now. Um, and I just want to be clear that we wouldn't make these arguments in the wrong setting. We wouldn't go up to someone at a rally who was holding up a sign that called ICE fascists and quote Trotsky at them. No way. That's not how to inspire or organize people. The reason we have these debates and the reason we make these arguments with those who will listen is that remaining clear about what fascism is very important for strategizing against it. We don't just meet people where they're at with theory. Of course, we will stand shoulder to shoulder with anyone protesting Trump, but we don't get loose with definitions just because a lot of other people are right now. We want to uphold our theory because theory is our best weapon in the struggle. And you can see that in the title of Trotsky's collection of essays, Fascism, What It Is and How to Fight It. Theory and action are given equal emphasis. So yeah, Marxists are pedantic about this for a reason. Most people in the mainstream use the word fascism vaguely or inexactly. If you look up fascism in Wikipedia, you'll see the opening paragraph is just a generic definition of a far-right dictatorship. And that's before you get to the part where they blame Bolshevism for it. Most people accept this definition, this generic definition. Marxists sometimes have more specific definitions of words in general use. We have a more specific or even technical definition of the terms working class and socialism, as you probably know. For similar reasons, we're also more technical about fascism. More importantly, we believe that if you get the definition wrong, it can lead to strategic mistakes in outlook in assessing what's happening and in organizing. Getting it wrong can lead you astray. That imperative comes out in Trotsky's writing on fascism, and in a situation like what's happening now, it can promote despair and panic. We want to prevent despair and panic, and that's why we're having these debates. So Trotsky wrote a lot on the topic of fascism, along with Clara Zetkin. He was arguably the most important theorist of fascism during the era when it first arose in Europe. The rise of fascism was intimately tied with the disastrous end of the revolutionary period in Europe in the 1920s, and that's why Trotsky paid such close analytical attention to it. This is something Trotsky wrote in a letter to a comrade in the UK in 1931. In order to be capable of foreseeing anything with regard to fascism, it is necessary to have a definition of that idea. What is fascism? What are its base, its form, and its characteristics? How will its development take place? It's necessary to proceed in a scientific and Marxian manner. So you can see that Uncle Leon himself was all about getting it right. So what is fascism? In that same letter, Trotsky said, it is a plebeian movement financed and directed by big capital. The genuine basis is the petty bourgeoisie. By plebeian, he means it's a mass movement, not just something imposed from the top down or installed in a coup, but something that originates in the streets. And the base of the mass movement is the petty bourgeoisie, but as Trotsky points out, some sectors of the proletariat became involved too. To illustrate this, Trotsky makes a distinction between the dictatorship of Miguel Primo de Rivera in Spain from 1920 to 1932 and the dictatorship of the OG fascist Mussolini in Italy. Primo de Rivera was an aristocrat and he had the support of the establishment, including the military. This makes it a much more standard, if no less appalling, state of affairs. Whereas the original fascist movement in Italy was made up of the frustrated petty bourgeoisie, it was a street movement, and that makes a difference. And for example, Trotsky points out that Mussolini had difficulty bringing the traditional military establishment into his project, which was at first driven by street militias and paramilitaries and other thugs. This was true of the Nazis too. A reminder of the definition of petty bourgeoisie. When we Marxists use the term, another one we're very specific about, it means small business owners, middle managers, bureaucrats, doctors, lawyers, priests, and others who don't depend on wage work for a living. They're not the big bourgeoisie, the investor class who runs society, and they're not workers who are dependent on a wage from the investor class. They're the people who either own their own businesses or they do contract work or their executives paid a high salary to manage other workers. They feel like they create their own wealth through their own hard work and virtue. They tend to be more individualistic, if not outright more conservative than average, than the average worker, and they avoid mass politics during ordinary times. For example, they want nothing to do with unions. The petty bourgeoisie roughly correlates to middle class. That's not an exact definition because you can earn a higher wage and live in a middle class neighborhood and still be of the proletariat, but it's okay to use that word loosely. Sometimes we do that, you know. The point is that when the petty bourgeoisie or the middle classes experience crisis and suffer and fear being displaced or pushed into the ranks of the working classes or the poor, that's when they often panic or get angry or lash out at others, whether immigrants or Jews or LGBTQ people. And that's when they'll set aside their aversions to organized politics and start to cohere into reactionary movements. There might be significant numbers of ex-soldiers in their ranks. This was true in Germany, where ex-soldiers who had been through World War I felt abandoned by society, and that can give the movement a militaristic vibe. And I think that does actually pertain to the current situation with lots of ex-soldiers who, you know, have far-right or fascist politics in the US after the endless wars. But in fascism, there's an extra step involved, which is that during a crisis such as the crises of Europe between the wars, such as the crisis in Chile in 1973, The capitalist class identifies this process happening and uses these angry petty bourgeoisie to their advantage and finances and arms them in paramilitaries to do their work, do their dirty work in repressing the proletariat. At these times, there's a revolutionary potential in the workers' movement, as there was in Germany during the revolutions in 1918 and 19, and in Italy during the revolution of 1920, and in Chile in 1973. At this point, big capital fears for its survival. The decision is made that they can no longer rely on ordinary bourgeois democracy, and it becomes necessary for them to arm bands of petty bourgeoisie to smash the workers' movement. What follows is a state of things where capital is still in charge, but there are no more workers' movement and no more democracy. And I'll get to this point in a little while, but I hope that that description of the way it goes down stands in contrast to what we're going through right now. You can see that it's a far more extreme situation. As Trotsky puts it in a 1932 essay, at the moment, the normal police and military resources of the bourgeois dictatorship, together with their parliamentary screens, no longer suffice to hold society in a state of equilibrium. The turn of the fascist regime arrives. Through the fascist agency, capitalism sets in motion the masses of crazed petty bourgeoisie and the bands of declassed and demoralized lumpen proletariat, all the countless human beings whom finance capital itself has brought to desperation and frenzy. I just love Trotsky's writing style. The way he describes this happening in Italy in November of 1920 is the textbook case of a fascist upsurge and takeover. And Trotsky also points out that in this process, the crazed petty bourgeoisie drags sections of frustrated workers with them. Fascism may be initially led by the petty bourgeoisie, but it definitely cuts across class lines, and that's one reason it's so dangerous. Another thing I want to stop and point out is that Trotsky refers to ordinary bourgeois democracy as a dictatorship, the dictatorship of capital over the workers and other classes. That's what we live in and what capitalism has been for centuries. This is why Marx, Engels, and Lenin called for a dictatorship of the proletariat, the only thing that can bring an end to the dictatorship of capital. The takeaway here is that capital functions like a dictatorship in normal times, even when we're granted limited democratic rights. And this is exactly why you label its more violent, when you label its more violent or repressive traits as fascism, it's an error. And it's one of the primary errors that I'm addressing here. So Trotsky identifies three key traits of a fascist state. In his words, fascism means workers' organizations are annihilated, the proletariat is reduced to an amorphous state, a system of administration is created which penetrates deeply into the masses and which serves to frustrate the independent crystallization of the proletariat. And by a system of administration, he means extensive police repression like the Gestapo, of course, but also an expanded bureaucracy. One way the Nazis dealt with unemployment was to hire thousands of new bureaucrats, and this bureaucracy ends up strangling opposition. None of this is even close to being true in the US right now. There are no fascist street armies big enough to smash working class organizations, no fascist bureaucracy powerful enough to do away with democracy completely, nor is that Trump's agenda, as I said, and I'll explain more of that in a bit. So next, I want to make a few distinctions and pull out a few strands because there are overlapping meanings when we use the word fascism. The first thing is to distinguish a fascist state. And I've already discussed what that is, so I'll get right to the next point. The next thing to distinguish is the fascist movement itself, the small but growing minority of people who openly support fascist politics. They may organize with greater or lesser success depending on conditions on the ground, and those conditions have been more favorable for them in the last decade or so. And in this category, there are two subcategories. The first of these is the street movement. Rick Kuhn here in Australia calls them the boot boys. They are familiar to us. In the US, we have the Three Percenters and the Proud Boys and so on. And, you know, the Proud Boys avoid the use of the term fascism and avoid Nazi imagery. And this is one way they're good at marketing, right? Or at least, you know, in their limited way, they're good at marketing. And this is one way they appeal to a lot of frustrated and confused young men. And then on the other hand, the outright fucking neo-Nazis who embrace all that imagery, like this trash who protested a drag queen story hour in Ohio a couple years ago, and they were opposed by our comrades there. And you know, they're clowns, but they're dangerous clowns. And when they feel comfortable to organize like this, it's something we definitely have to pay attention to. The second subcategory of open fascists are the ones who work in the political sphere and wear suits and ties and are a bit more palatable in the mainstream, but they're very much fascist themselves. Prime example of this is the AfD, or Alternative for Germany. through their campaigns against immigrants and preying on the downwardly mobile middle class's fears about austerity and the Great Replacement and so on. They've really legitimized the same kinds of politics that were practiced by the Nazis, and they've gained a lot of power in certain states in just 10 years since their formation. The AfD are quite strong in several state assemblies in Germany, and they're part of a far-right coalition that has a number of seats in the European Parliament too. And everyone, as people often joke, like, well, this should end well. They also have strong connections to the street movement, the Boot Boys, and in some towns in Germany, immigrants have to worry about even doing day-to-day things like going to the grocery store. And the AfD are really good at exploiting social media, including TikTok, to appeal to a younger audience. That combination of political power plus a street movement is how fascism happens. I don't think there's anything happening on this kind of scale in the US. MAGA, as it is today, can't really compare. This would be like if the Proud Boys had a political party that was dominant in several state legislatures around the country and had a much bigger street movement at the same time. But this is an international movement, as shown by Elon Musk's open support for AfD and their connections with fascist movements on the ground here in the US. So, this is not to downplay the threat. We have to be wary. Okay. The third thing to differentiate is right-wing politicians who are not fascist, but who may lend them tacit support. Donald Trump is a good example of this. Trump certainly has uncomfortable proximity to the far right, perhaps most damningly in his role in the January 6th riot. It's easy to picture someone like Trump approving of and benefiting from a fascist takeover of the government if that were to take place, but we're nowhere near this stage yet, and we at Firebrand think it's incorrect to label him as a fascist. Now, of course, that's going to be a controversial statement for some. But let's make some comparisons. January 6th was a relatively disorganized and ideologically incoherent riot, nothing close to a fascist uprising. In an article at Tempest from last year, Dan Davison and Sasha Martin lay out some of these arguments. They quote historian Richard Evans, who wrote that January 6th bears no comparison to the hundreds of thousands of armed and uniformed stormtroopers and squadristi that the Nazi and fascist leaders deployed onto the streets daily in the 20s and early 30s to intimidate, beat up, arrest, imprison, and often kill political opponents. So Trump has no real paramilitary movement and no real support from the capitalist class or the military for a fascist takeover. This is a key point. Fascism is a cudgel wielded by the ruling classes when they're desperate, and we're nowhere near that stage yet. They don't want to make a dictator out of Trump. That would really be counter to their goals. There's a more sophisticated argument that goes, okay, this isn't a fascist state yet, but Trump and his minions are trying to make it one. We don't agree. Bourgeois democracy is stable enough for the ruling class right now to keep workers in line and keep extracting profits. Now, of course, it's less stable than it was, but it's stable enough still, okay? Trotsky wrote that the big bourgeoisie likes fascism as little as a man with aching molars likes to have his teeth pulled, something they only want to do in an emergency. So we would argue that we haven't reached some new threshold, but that Trump is merely accelerating the neoliberal policies of recent decades, entrenching the violence and oppression that are built into capitalism. As wild and off the chain as he has more in common with Reagan, both George Bush's, and even with his arch nemesis Biden than he does with Hitler. Trump himself is an opportunist grifter who's hijacked the Republican Party and doesn't have a fascist party himself. That's another key thing, okay? Now, certainly, this is all dangerous enough in and of itself. You don't have to think Trump is a fascist to view him as noxious, corrosive, and dangerous. We don't need to misuse that word to inspire us to organize against him. We oppose him with everything we have, okay? I'm also not arguing that a future instance of American fascism would resemble German or Italian fascism in a one-to-one way. We don't want to be that wooden in our thinking. And, we are accused of that, but we are, I believe we're refuting that. And we have to be clear in assessing the social forces at work and not give in to panic. That brings me to the fourth and final thing to distinguish, which is the general conditions that signal a dangerous turn to the right in society. The widespread embrace of these ideas and the emergence of an angry, paranoid, sometimes violent petty bourgeoisie. This, I think, is true of the mass movement that supports Trump. We saw more concentrated instances of it in the right-wing protests during COVID lockdown in the US and Canada and here in Australia. Just picking on these chuds here in Australia because I hate them so much. This is an anti-lockdown rally from a few years ago. I don't think it's incorrect to say that this is the human material of fascism. These people aren't as sharply defined as the Proud Boys or the January 6th rioters, but they're the ordinary people who are ready for a broader fascist movement if and when it does coalesce. If you look at the values of the people who embraced fascism in Europe in the 30s and the values of these people today, they're very comparable. They're extreme nationalists, they're anti-immigrant, of course, they're racist. The whole concept of the nation and their national identity is tied into their racism. They have a really toxic conception of masculinity and gender. They're ableist, they're homophobic. Obviously, they're rabidly anti-trans. Uh, and, the original fascists were too. That's something that's been erased from history. And they have a really gross idea of purity, whether it's racial or gender purity, and a fear of things like quote unquote contagion and weakness. You can see that in their talking points on Twitter and stuff. This is why trans folks have been sounding the alarm about how the rhetoric now matches the rhetoric towards Jewish, disabled, and trans folks in Europe 100 years ago. They're also superstitious, they're anti-intellectual, anti-science, anti-vax, and conspiracy-minded. Um, Reading Trotsky on the culture of fascism in 1933, it's so relatable for us when we think of MAGA or QAnon or the way modern day right-wingers are obsessed with like ancient Rome or medieval chivalry. He talks about their darkness and ignorance and how the 10th century lives alongside the 20th. We agree that this movement has fascist characteristics and is very dangerous. Okay, it's just that we distinguish between these social conditions and imminent fascism. I think it's also important to point out that these people are in the minority no matter what they tell themselves, but we have to keep organizing against them. So one thing we want to separate away from the discussion about fascism is what is bad and has always been bad under capitalism and bourgeois democracy. Police repression has always existed under capitalism. As Lenin pointed out in State and Revolution, it's a feature of the system, not a bug. Racism has always existed under capitalism. Again, a feature required by the system, especially since slavery was definitive for the first few centuries of capitalism. Imperialist war has always existed under capitalism. When you get fuzzy with the definition and start applying it to any instance of fascism, or excuse me, and start applying it to any instance of violence and repression, then the word loses meaning. Is structural racism fascist? Then all of US history is fascist. What's the point of identifying a change in conditions or the threat of the far right if that's the case? There was a book published last year, The Black Anti-Fascist Tradition, uh, which argues this very thing. The history of the US is fascist because white supremacy is in nature fascist. As our comrade Steve Lee, who's in the room right now, wrote, this analysis turns fascism into an amorphous influence on everything rather than a specific structure and set of policies decided on by the ruling class in extreme circumstances. This is wrong for two reasons. It is not dialectical. It draws conclusions by comparing surface features of racism in the US with surface features of fascism rather than looking at their essence. And it is ahistorical and anachronistic. And I would just add that this is true even, the Nazis were influenced by Jim Crow. That's, not a secret. And it's an important aspect of their dynamic and what they did, but we don't agree that that makes Jim Crow fascism, okay? The problem with these types of arguments is that they let bourgeois democracy off the hook. As Marxists, we argue that bourgeois democracy is inherently repressive, and that's why we want to overthrow it and bring about socialism. We have to make people understand that even in normal times, awful things happen under capitalism. And you can see this when you compare some of the awful things Trump is doing to other awful moments in US history. Trump is smashing the social safety net. He's rolling back progressive reforms, overseeing mass deportations, and violating the Constitution in the name of security. All of these things have been done at various times in the past by his predecessors. Woodrow Wilson deported suspected socialists and anarchists during the Palmer raids of 1919. FDR rounded up Japanese immigrants and put them in concentration camps. I'm just looking at this image. I'm just I don't think I don't know. I just don't think people remember how horrible this was. Sometimes I often think about Obama's extrajudicial drone assassination of a 16-year-old U.S. citizen, Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, in Yemen in 2013. I think it's fair to consider that a pivotal moment that led us to Trump. Okay, as horrible as Trump is, as bad as things are now, it's not a qualitative new state of things. So we can break these theoretical errors down into two broad tendencies, liberal and ultra-left. While these are different errors with different political ideologies behind them, ironically, in some ways, they are pretty compatible and their history overlaps. There is the liberal tendency to label Republicans as fascists, mainly for the purpose of electioneering, the familiar tactic of lesser evilism. Hal Draper called this out in his classic 1967 essay, Who's Going to be the Lesser Evil in 1968. He talks about a colleague who was panicking over Ronald Reagan's election as governor of California and who was saying, "This is how Hitler got started. The Republicans have to be portrayed as monsters in order to justify voting for the Democrats, who then end up doing all the same things, such as defoliating Vietnam, as Lyndon Johnson did in the example cited by Draper." And while Trump is more of a loose cannon than Reagan and represents a much more advanced level of degradation, it's still the same phenomenon at work. When Democrats called Trump a fascist during the election campaign, for example, in all the fear-mongering over Project 2025, they weren't being sober in their assessment of the threat, and they weren't calling for anti-fascist organizing at the grassroots level. They were just calling for votes. And it's damning when you compare liberal attitudes about Project 2025 to their attitudes about Project 2024, as we call it. They weren't worried about the severe repression of student protests for Palestine at universities, where free speech and the right to assemble were being seriously challenged and still are. And you can see that democracy in the US has eroded in some ways that don't have to do with Trump. The outcome is that you vote for Democrats, you vote for union busting and genocide, and then you become disillusioned when they inevitably betray you. You've been told the way to fight fascism is by voting, and you see everything getting worse. Even worse than Democrats doing this is when socialists who should know better do it, who give up their principles of opposing capitalist parties in order to justify voting for Democrats to beat Trump, as many socialists did for Biden and Harris, and by Obama and all the way back. It has the effect of diluting understanding of the real dangers on the ground. Okay, so then there's ultra-leftism, which leads to the conclusion that fascism is already happening now or always has been. This has a really detrimental impact on your strategy. It can lead you to excessive security culture, which we see in some orgs with the insistence that protesters hide their faces or blur photographs, or even worse, when protests are called off because of paranoia. I've literally seen some leftist groups do this this year, tell people to avoid protests because it's too dangerous. We would argue that not protesting is more dangerous. Going underground is what the left has to do during an actual fascist takeover. Doing it prematurely is disastrous because mass organizing is really the best way of resisting the state and the rise of the far right. In more extreme cases, ultra-leftism can lead to individual terrorism, which is a foolish and useless strategy for combating the capitalist state. But more often, in ordinary people who encounter these kinds of attitudes when they're radicalizing, it just leads to despair, nihilism, and giving up. You think everything's already stacked against you in a fascist state, and you're not going to have much hope of organizing for change. Now, as with many bad ideas on the left, what at first seems to be the product of vague thinking or lack of analysis can in fact be traced to, you guessed it, Stalinism. This is what Marxist journalist and SWP leader George Levon Weissman wrote in the 1960s about the Stalinist history of the misuse of the term fascism in their ultra-left period. That so many of those calling themselves Marxists cannot define fascism any more adequately than the liberals is not wholly their fault. Whether they are aware of it or not, much of their intellectual heritage comes from the social democratic and Stalinist movements which dominated the left in the 1930s when fascism was scoring victory after victory. To the Stalinist, he goes on, every capitalist party was automatically fascist. Even more catastrophic than this disorienting of the workers was Stalin's famous dictum that rather than being opposites, fascism and social democracy were twins. The socialists were thereupon dubbed social fascists and regarded as the main enemy of the communists. Of course, there could be no united front with social fascist organizations, and those who, like Trotsky, urged such united fronts were also labeled social fascists and treated accordingly. How divorced from reality, he goes on, how divorced from reality the Stalinist line was may be illustrated by recalling its translation into American terms. In the 1932 elections, American Stalinists denounced Franklin Roosevelt as the fascist candidate and Norman Thomas as the social fascist candidate. What was ludicrous as applied to US politics was tragic in Germany and Australia, and he means that it enabled the rise of fascism there. Okay, so what's even more ludicrous about this is that just a few years later, the Stalinist parties, including the CPUSA, abandoned ultra-leftism, flipped the script, and now had their followers support the liberal parties, including the Democrats. This strategy was known as the Popular Front, and it was also a disaster for completely different reasons. For example, it meant that the demands of black communists were set aside for decades so that the CP could support the party of Jim Crow. And keep in mind that these whimsical changes in strategy were all done to serve the needs of Stalin's foreign policy, just to show you how destructive Stalinism was for the international left everywhere. That's a different history, but it does bear on this conversation because it shows the common roots of ultra-leftism and liberalism regarding their bad takes on fascism. Returning to Trotsky, in 1931, he wrote about the Communist Party of Italy and its fatal errors with regards to the fascist threat. And this talk is about overdiagnosing fascism, but as Trotsky shows, underdiagnosing it is very much a problem too. As he writes, in its eyes, that is, in the eyes of the Communist Party of Italy, fascism appeared to be only capitalist reaction. He has that in scare quotes. The particular traits of fascism which spring from the mobilization of the petty bourgeoisie against the proletariat, the Communist Party was unable to discern. So he's saying that the Italian communists didn't distinguish a difference between fascism and capitalism. They didn't see that qualitative difference, which we are arguing hasn't happened yet in the US, but which was definitely happening in Italy then. So this is why I'm arguing that we want to get our vocabulary right? And our theory. Check out how incisive Trotsky is here about why we have to get it right when he moves on to the German Communist Party's similar errors that were unfolding in real time as he wrote. The leadership of the German Communist Party today reproduces almost literally the position from which the Italian communists took their point of departure. Fascism is nothing else but capitalist reaction. From the point of view of the proletariat, the difference between diverse types of capitalist reaction are meaningless. To insist that fascism is already here, or to deny the very possibility of its coming to power, amounts politically to one and the same thing. By ignoring the specific nature of fascism, the will to fight against it inevitably becomes paralyzed. Now, keep in mind, he was writing this 2 years before the Nazis took power. Now, that last line is important, and it's one of the points I want to be the main takeaway of this talk. As he says in the same essay, the first characteristic of a really revolutionary party is to be able to look reality in the face. One conclusion we can draw from Trotsky is that the best way to fight fascism is to build a revolutionary movement. As he says, the gigantic growth of National Socialism is an expression of two factors: a deep social crisis, throwing the petty bourgeois masses off balance, and a lack of a revolutionary party that would be regarded by the masses of the people as an acknowledged revolutionary leader. If the Communist Party is the party of revolutionary hope, then fascism as a mass movement is the party of counter-revolutionary despair. So we argued that this is not fascism, but the fascist movement is growing, and the stakes might become higher at some point in the future, whether soon or later, you know. The only effective way to combat it is with a mass movement of workers, the oppressed, socialists, and other anti-fascists in a united front. And in order to effectively organize, you need to be very clear in your theory and your communications. We need to be able to convince people who are just now radicalizing and to convince the ordinary people who might join us in a coalition, an anti-fascist coalition, that we know what we're talking about. And perhaps most importantly, we need to convince them that there's hope of victory. When you say the US is now fascist, or that it's always been, it's impactful, it appeals to the emotions, it has enough of a kernel of truth in it to seem right, but it doesn't stand up to analysis and therefore it's misleading. It's just an emotive buzzword. And the thing is, if you believe the US has descended into fascism, if you believe you're fighting a new and uniquely dangerous threat, you might give up hope. I just want to leave you with this image of the huge anti-fascist mobilization in Boston in 2017, 1 week after the deadly Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. A group of 50 far-right chuds was badly outnumbered by thousands of counter-protesters, including many comrades of ours, but also lots of ordinary people. These counter-protests are so important because it helps isolate and demoralize the fascists. We saw similar mobilizations after the pogroms against Muslims in the UK last year. And I love this photo because just look at how outnumbered this clown is. The mistake these thugs in the UK made is in thinking they represented the majority because a lot of people resent economic austerity or because a lot of people are casually racist. They think they represent the will of the people when they burn a mosque, when in fact they don't. The lesson here is that the majority of people will oppose far-right violence when it comes down to it, but you have to get out and organize them. And that's how you defeat the fascists. The more they're outnumbered in the streets, the less chance they have of building momentum. And this is why organizing against them before they have a chance to build is so important. There are many reasons to find hope right now in solidarity and resistance. Our enemies are on the rampage, but they're not all powerful, far from it. They have many weaknesses. It's so important to organize out in the open for as long as we still have the chance. While we still have our rights and while we still have the power to organize and fight together, we have to use it, okay? And we can't let fear dictate our politics.